أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
I just wanted to welcome you all. Thank you so much for coming. In light of everything that's going on in the socio-political climate, we know that the Quran is super important, which is why tonight we're presenting a lecture on Quran, Scripture Misunderstood. To give you a little background on our speaker, he grew up in Oak Park, and through studying African American history in high school and then at DePaul, more specifically studying mathematics, he eventually came to Islam and accepted it in 1994. Since then, he's helped to do so much. He founded Ummah, an organization at DePaul, and also interested in Muslim action at Refugee Navy at Hafizah, which he has held many positions from, like volunteer to board of directors there. In addition to that, he graduated from Georgetown University Law Center in 1998 and is an attorney and practiced as an attorney and guardian ad litem for children in Cook County at the Cook County Child Protective Services. He's also acted as an imam of the Intercity Islamic Center, and right now he acts as a chaplain for DePaul. So any of you from DePaul have probably seen him around. We are very privileged to have him speaking tonight. He's sort of a Renaissance man, so please welcome Reverend Bilal Ryan.
This question? Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, so let me just get a sense of who I'm talking to here. So I know that it seems like a good amount of Muslims here, but how many people here are not Muslim? Alhamdulillah, so that's good. And are the people who are not Muslim, do people know a lot about the Quran, or just starting to learn about the Quran, or what? A little bit? Okay. So definitely, I'm going to have a little bit, introduction to get going and touch on some themes that I think are important to talk about. And definitely, but one of the main purposes is any questions people have. So just, if you have a question, just raise your hand during the talk, or make sure you get out your questions as soon as you can, because I want to spend the time talking about what people are interested in more than what I'm interested in. So that's the whole idea of this event, is that we have, especially for non-Muslims, we have a lot of times the Quran is in the news or Islam is in the news, and you may have questions or something, and you may or may not have a Muslim you can talk to about it. So this is the time we can have some discussion, and you don't have to worry, you don't have to wonder, but you can just ask. So because that's my hope and my purpose and why I came here, I won't be offended by any question, or I won't be offended by any kind of even comment people want to make about the Quran, but inshallah, I just ask that everyone be open to discussion, and I think everyone is, and that's why you came here, so we should have a good discussion. So if you'll notice, let me just start by talking a little bit about my own personal kind of experience with the Quran. So as mentioned, because it may be different, for people who are born Muslim, depending on your family's, level of religiosity, you may grow up with the Quran always around, or you may grow up knowing, you may grow up with the Quran always on the shelf somewhere, but not really in your life a lot. But for me, as a non-Muslim, I grew up with no exposure to the Quran. So, and as far as I know, maybe I did, but I didn't know that they were Muslim, or I wasn't that conscious of it at the time. But as far as I know, I didn't really know any Muslims, at least through high school. So I probably did know some, but it never came up in conversation. So this was before 9/11 and everything, so Islam was not a big topic of discussion as it is now. So the first time that I came into contact with the Quran was actually, as it was mentioned, that I was really in high school and in college, I was really into African American history. So the first time I bought a Quran when I was in high school, got it from like an Afrocentric bookstore on the west side, and they had a Quran. I think it was like a translation that's done by the Ahmadiyya movement, which is a particular sect of Islam. That for some reason the Nation of Islam likes to use their translation. Exactly. I think the history is because the Ahmadiyya movement actually did a lot of dawah and preaching in the African American community in America, even before a lot of Sunnis were doing it. So I picked up the translation. I grew up as a Catholic, so I don't know if people are Catholic here, but my particular experience growing up as a Catholic, I didn't spend a lot of time studying the Bible or reading the Bible myself. The Bible would be read during Mass and stuff, but I didn't really feel a close connection with the Bible. I went to public schools, but I went to like CCD classes and we studied things about the religion and stuff, but I wouldn't say I really knew much about the Bible. But the Quran, when I came into contact with the Quran, so first you have a nice little prayer, the opening, the Fatiha. Then you have chapter 2, the cow. Okay, that's all I can remember is that. So chapter 2, the cow. And I didn't really get into it. And if I had more experience with the Bible, especially Surah Al-Baqarah, would have made more sense. Like I could have realized some of the stories, and it would have made more sense to get into it. But because I didn't even have that much contact with the Bible, I couldn't really get into the Quran. So the English translation of it didn't really impress me that much. But I still always carried it around in school and stuff because I thought it was cool to have a Quran and show that I was very Afrocentric and stuff like that. So even though I'm Irish, that's a different story. But so I didn't really get a close relationship with, but as I said, in college I became Muslim and started to get. At that point, obviously I had respect for the Quran. And some people say that they come to Islam through reading the Quran, even in translation. That wasn't my experience. So even though I continued to have respect for the Quran and I had to learn some of it for prayers and stuff, it still was, especially the translations at that time. In recent years, there's been an explosion of a lot more English translations. So you can look at different things and different styles and stuff. Back then, it was basically the Yusuf Ali and some other ones picked out, but they're all basically in Old English and a very foreign style, which is appealing in a way, but it's kind of disconnecting. It's kind of you don't necessarily know if you understand the meaning, but it may sound nice. I actually asked the sister to read the Pickstyle translation of that verse because I really like how it sounds, but it is kind of in a different style. Actually, the best I like of the Quran, and I love this verse especially, is there's these tapes that I got when I first became Muslim that have a sheikh named Sheikh Husari reciting the Quran very slowly, and then it has an English translation reading the Pickstyle of this guy named Aslam Azhar, who's a BBC announcer with the English accent, and it sounds awesome. So I encourage anyone to check that out. You can find it free on the internet now. But where was that? So the Quran. So I say the first few years that I was Muslim, even though I learned a little bit for my prayers, but other than that, I think I was kind of afraid of the Quran. Okay, I was afraid of the Quran because why? Does anyone know why I was afraid of the Quran? Can you guess? Okay, that would have been smart. I wasn't that smart. No, so that's a good point. That's a good point. That wasn't it. Yes? Yes? Okay. Right, I couldn't read Arabic, and Arabic is in a whole different, I had studied Spanish and stuff, but Arabic's in a whole different, letters, okay? So I couldn't even, pronounce it. So when I look at it, I'm just looking at, lines on a page, okay? I can't even read it. So, and I thought, to read this will be really hard, to read this. So I had, how I learned the short surahs at the end was through this thing they call transliteration, okay? Where you have, a book that does it in Roman letters, in Latin letters, okay? But even then, it's kind of weird, and especially back then, the transliteration, I don't know how they chose which letters to use, but it doesn't sound exactly right, and so you always know that if you read it according to that, you're reading it wrong. And actually, the teachers I have now, my Arabic teachers and stuff, they hate transliteration. They wish it didn't exist. But it helps some people in the beginning. But so I was so afraid, and to be honest, it took me 5 years before I even really started studying. Because I was just afraid that it would be really difficult. And when I actually sat down, and a brother who, and may Allah reward him forever, he'll get reward for every single, letter of Quran I read for the rest of my life. He just came and, said, I'm going to go teach you how to read it. And just pulled me aside and said, I'm going to teach you to read the letters. And really, to be honest, it took only, alhamdulillah, I'm not still good at reading the Quran, but it took me only a couple months before I could read it, at least, It's really very easy once someone just starts showing you the letters, okay? So I encourage anyone who's interested in reading the Quran that don't be afraid of it. It's very easy. We know as Muslims, the more, there's so much reward to reciting the Quran, and for people who have a hard time doing it, there's even more reward. So it's really nothing to be shy of, nothing to be scared of. And you'll find, so I went from that to learning how to recite it a little, but I would always, I didn't have much meaning. And then after study and study and study, pretty soon you start to realize the Quran is a very unique book, okay? So if some people ask you, especially back in the day, if someone asks you what was the Quran, how would you define the Quran? If someone tells you what is the Quran, what would you say it is? I never heard of this Quran, what is it? That's a very, very good, very polite way of putting it. What probably like the average person would just say like, yeah, the Quran is the Muslim Bible, right? That's how they would describe it. And you're right, in the sense of what you're saying is correct. That the Quran is a scripture that Muslims believe is revealed from God that's sacred to the Muslims. Just like the Bible is sacred to Christians and Jews, and other scriptures may be sacred to Hindus and other religious groups. So that's correct. But if you look at it the way I put it, which sometimes people used to say like the Quran is the Muslim Bible, it's correct in the sense that they're both scriptures that those groups hold to be revelation, but it's not correct in that the Quran and the Bible are actually very different books in the style, in the way they come across, in how you read them, and what you get out of them. And Muslims believe that the Torah, which is the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible, and then the Injil, the Gospel or the New Testament, we believe those are revelations from God. Now, whether they're in exactly the same form, that's something we can really talk about. But we believe that, but at the same time, they're just so different from what the Quran is. So if you're actually someone who does know the Bible well, like I wasn't, and you come to read the Quran will not, you won't get it. If you're looking for something like the Bible, you'll say this is not like the Bible. You might even think this is not as good as the Bible, or this is not as high quality as the Bible, especially if you're reading English translation. And that's one thing as I spent more time with the Quran. So the first thing, then I went to law school, and I was just, during law school, I didn't even really know still how to read the script. But I was living in a house with Muslim brothers, some of whom were very good. So that was the first time I was living in an environment where I used to hear the Quran recited, okay? Because mashallah, these were good brothers. They didn't have a TV or anything. So you'd hear the Quran recited, and you'd also hear their discussion. And they weren't like always pious, but they would read the Quran. So, alhamdulillah, so I would hear the Quran being recited, during the night and as they're staying up, and it becomes more a part of you. And then, after I got married, and I know when I got married, every time I would go visit my in-laws' house, my father-in-law would constantly be reciting the Quran, like all the time. He'd be reciting the Quran, and he would always get up, mashallah, every morning before Fajr for a couple hours to be reciting the Quran throughout the whole house. And mashallah, very beautiful. So this continues to, deepen your relationship with the Quran. And once you start to spend time around the Quran, especially people who know how to recite it well and correctly, you start to see, you start to feel a connection to it. Because the Quran, some of the things about the Quran, you notice these verses that I had Nada read. What's something you notice about those, the way those verses went? Yes? Yeah, no, definitely that's true. Some Muslims might get offended if you say musical, because they don't like music, but it's definitely the rhythm. It has a rhythm, right? It definitely has a rhythm. So, and I specifically chose those verses because, that's a very good example of a perfect example of it, but that's true throughout the Quran, right? It has this rhythm. And how does it get that rhythm? Can anyone tell? Like the way that it was, Inna al-Muslimeen wal-Muslimat wal-Mu'mineen wal-Mu'minat. So why is it that that rhythm, all those words have the same rhythm? Because of Arabic language, right? The Arabic language is based on 3-letter roots that then go into certain patterns to make words. So if you take different roots and put them in the same pattern, you're going to keep getting the same rhythm over and over. So if you want to find the name for a man who submits to God, or the description for a man who submits to God and a woman who submits to God, they're going to be mu'mineen or mu'minat, okay? And then for a woman who fasts and a man who fasts, you're going to have that at for the woman, the taf. You're going to keep seeing those repeating patterns because it's going to be the same. It's like a verb conjugation, but even to more extent than you would have in other languages. And you don't have that as much in English. They have to get rhythm in other ways. But in Arabic, mashallah, with the 3-letter root system, it's very easy to get this kind of rhythm. And you see that throughout the Quran. And does anyone know the story behind that ayah? What's the story behind that ayah? Why does Allah keep saying the Muslim man who do this and the woman who do this, and the women who fast and the men who fast, and the woman who guard the non-see, the men who guard the non-see? Does anyone know why does Allah keep making that point?
Probably just separate gender.
Okay, but in each each one he's describing, he's saying the men and the women do the exact same thing. Right? He's using the thing, yeah, not throughout the whole Quran, but I'm saying in this particular verses, he's using the exact same roots for each one. He's saying men who fast and women who fast, men who guard their mercy, women who guard their mercy. Right? But that's a good, I think you're on the right track. Obviously, he's drawing attention to the fact that he's separating the two genders. Because, does anyone know?
It came from a complaint, right?
I don't know if you want to call it a complaint, but you go ahead.
Yeah. No, there was one of the Sahabiyat, and she said that the verses are always talking about men, basically.
Right, so now the way the Arabic language works, if it had just said the Muslimin, right, that could include men and women, actually, right? If you're talking about a group of men and women, you use the male for both, okay? So there'll be parts of the Quran where it just refers to it just uses the masculine form, and it's understood to mean men and women, okay? But Salama radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, she asked him, we always see that it's using the masculine form in the Quran. What about the women? Why is Allah, is it just talking about men, or why is Allah always using the masculine form, or what should we take from this? And so then, the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't really say anything, and then this revelation came from Allah, that Allah is stressing this point, that the Muslim man and the Muslim woman, the believing man and the believing woman, the fasting man and the fasting woman. So it goes to show, and then how does it end? They all have a promise of forgiveness from their Lord, and forgiveness and a vast reward. So maghfirah and a vast reward. So all of these people have that. So Allah is making the point that in this ayah and in the rest of the Quran, men and women are completely spiritually equal, and if a man fasts and a woman fasts, they'll both get the same reward. And that Allah is promising the same reward. And He's going to specifically point out that just because the way Arabic grammar works, that you don't always have to mention women, it doesn't mean that I'm not leaving the women out, and specifically I'll mention the first. And it's very beautiful. So, okay, what else are some unique aspects of the Quran that make it different from the Bible?
I don't know much about the Quran, but I study New Testament here at Loyola, and we talk and teach Bible, and we talk about how it was composed over a millennium by many different authors. And if I understand correctly, in Islam, there's one author of the Quran.
Yes. So yeah, that's a very good point. So that's another reason why to say that the Quran is the Muslim Bible, to say that the comparison is not correct, because, and it's also why, another reason why, I'll make that point in a second, but yes, the Bible is made up of different books, right? And each book, some of them, a single author might write more than one book, but each book doesn't necessarily have to be written by the same person. There's many different authors, as you mentioned. So that's not true of the Quran. Okay, the Quran, and of course for Muslims, the Quran is the author. Who is the author of the Quran? And whether we use the term author is not even, I don't know for sure, but the Quran is the kalam of Allah, the speech of God for Muslims. We believe the Quran is the speech of God. So not that it's inspired by God, or not that it's somehow motivated by God, or God kind of gave the meaning, but then a human put it into words. But Muslims believe that the Quran is actually literally the speech of God. So what are some of the implications? If the Quran is the speech of God, then it's not created, right? Because it's literally kalam of Allah, it's literally an aspect of God. So we don't believe that God can be created anytime. So God's speech was always existed. It's kind of outside of time. Okay? So the Quran is kind of outside of time. It's not a creation. Something that always existed. But it revealed unto the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, gradually. Okay? So it's in this place called the Lawh al-Mahfuz, the preserved tablet. We believe the Quran is in existence there in completion. Then it was revealed at a time on Laylatul Qadr down to Laylatul Qadr, meaning the night of power, in the 27th of Ramadan, when Muslims usually try to make sure to pray during the night and hope for the rewards from Allah. This was when it was revealed down to the lowest, one of the lower heavens, okay? And then over 23 years, it was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So different revelations would come at different times. But to a Muslim, it always existed. Okay, it wasn't just being made up at that time. It always existed, but it's being revealed at that time. So, now I ask you, I don't know how you would answer this, if you, in terms of New Testament, so if someone asks, I want to know something that Jesus, peace be upon him, said. I want to know exactly what he said in the language that he said. Can you tell me something like that?
Just a few phrases that are contained in Aramaic, but most of it was written in Greek.
Right.
Which would not be his everyday language.
Okay. So yeah, so for the most part, or is all the New Testament in Greek?
All of the New Testament was written in Greek as it's come down to us.
Okay. And so this is a good point. So there's some phrases in Aramaic that are contained in the New Testament?
A few.
Okay, a few phrases. So you might be able to point to a few phrases and say that this is something that we believe that Jesus, peace be upon him, spoke in Aramaic, which you're saying that was probably the language day to day. Okay. So, and as we know, because of the Bible, the New Testament books were written at later times based off oral tradition. Is that
That's the general thing.
So someone asked this, and they said, like you said, either that we only have a few phrases, or we don't know that much. We might know more teachings that are contained in the Gospels, but that they're in, not in the original language or not exactly quoted. And we know each Gospel has different perspectives and different details of the life of Jesus, peace be upon him. So, if we were to say, from a Muslim perspective, do we know anything that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said exactly how he said it? What would we say as Muslims?
Yeah.
What do you think? Do we know anything exactly the way the Prophet, peace be upon him, said it in the language that he said it? Okay, we know the hadith are the statements of the Prophet, peace be upon him, right? So those are recorded, and then scholars, go through mechanisms to determine which is authentic and what is not authentic. And we have those in the Arabic language that he spoke, right? Peace be upon him. How about and we know, how about the Quran? We have the Quran. Okay, so we have the Quran, which again, I know you probably didn't mention because it's not the words of Muhammad, we don't believe, peace be upon him. So, but it is words that he spoke, right? The Quran was all revealed through Muhammad, peace be upon him. So, we know what he said, and we know what language was he speaking. Muhammad, peace be upon him. Okay, I think it's too easy when no one wants to say it. Arabic, okay. Was it Arabic that he was speaking different from what the Quran did, or the same?
Same.
I mean, same language. Obviously, you weren't necessarily. He wasn't always talking in Allah's speech, of course, but he's talking. It's the same language. Yeah. No one had trouble understanding it. Not that maybe some phrase because of the eloquence of it, they weren't maybe familiar with it, or they weren't sure what Allah was getting at because it's very deep. But no one said what language is this that you're talking? This was the language that they spoke to each other. Okay, so. And because of tajweed, right, you study tajweed rules, we not only know what he said in Arabic, but we know exactly how he pronounced it, peace be upon him, right? Like people study for years to know exactly all the way he pronounced it. So we could, if someone knows tajweed and knows all the different qira'ah especially, they can sit there, and I've had teachers of mine who have done this before me, they could go through and read the Quran and read exactly the way that the Prophet Muhammad, a few places he had different ways of pronouncing certain words. They can give you each example. These are all the different ways that he ever pronounced this word. Peace be upon him. So we have all that. You had a question?
I was going to say, both Moses and Jesus didn't speak Arabic. So are you now saying that communication is not being related to the Quran, or is it being translated into Arabic?
Right. So because they didn't speak in Arabic, you're saying where it quotes like Moses.
Oh, no, I'm asking a question because you're saying that Muhammad is better at communicating through Arabic because we have the original Arabic. But then, if that's true, then Jesus and Moses are not being properly communicated in the Quran if it's also in Arabic, is what they're saying.
Right. I'm not even necessarily trying to say that it's better or not being quoted. I'm just saying it's interesting to observe that we can know exactly what Prophet Muhammad taught. We can know exactly what he said in the language that he said.
But then we don't know exactly what Jesus
And I'm saying Jesus, we don't know necessarily exactly. I'm not making a comment as to whether what the translator, the people who translated his teachings into Greek or told about his life in Greek, I'm not saying they did a bad job. I'm not trying to argue one is better than the other. I'm just saying it's a difference between the two. That we have the actual words that the Prophet Muhammad spoke, and we don't necessarily have the actual literal words that Jesus spoke.
In the Quran.
Meaning, we have the actual words that the Prophet Muhammad spoke. In the Bible, we don't necessarily have that many of the actual words that Jesus spoke. In the Quran, now this is the point that
They don't have it either.
okay, you're right. In the Quran, now they will quote Jesus. There are places where it quotes Jesus, where it quotes Moses, where it quotes Abraham. So other prophets who are mentioned also in the Bible are mentioned in the Quran, and they use their speak in Arabic, right? So you're right. Though in those cases we don't necessarily, and some scholars have debated this in certain ways, but we don't necessarily have the exact words that they speak. But we have their speech being translated by who? This would be the Muslim point that Allah is translating. So there's no problem with Allah doing a mistranslation. That would be perfect. We wouldn't have to worry about Allah doing. If a human being does a translation, there's always a chance that it's not even so much that you're going to make a mistake. It's that you always, if you're doing a translation, you have to make a choice. What does this word? What word in this other language am I going to choose to represent this word? And you might have different choices that give different shades of meaning, or you might say, "Man, this is frustrating. There's no word in this language that gives that exact meaning to this other language that this word has." But so a Muslim would say that the Quran, when it gives some of the lessons that other prophets might have taught, or put words in their mouth, that it's Allah who's communicating the message, so he's not making a mistake. But this is, or he's not. I mean, the active translation is being done by God. It's not being done by a human being. So that's the only difference I would say. And again, I'm really not trying to make a point about who's someone better than the other. I'm just trying to draw differences for people. But that's a good question. So let me. What time is it?
4:59.
And when do we want to end? Probably have to pray around 5:30. Okay, so as I said, if people have questions, why don't you get them out? I have a bunch more topics I wanted to talk about, but I know we're not going to get to everything. So if there's things people had a question about, I don't want to leave without getting to.
Do you want to address the criticism sometimes a little bit of the Quran that it's disorganized?
Yeah, so this is a very good point. This is another thing that people who read the Quran will say. The New Testament and the Old Testament, in general, they have different subjects depending on the book and stuff. But at least if we say the Gospels is basically told as a story, like the story of the life of Jesus. Basically, yeah. So basically the Gospels are like, here's the life of Jesus. You know, some of them have the birth and some of them go to the crucifixion, okay? So the Quran is not like that. It's not a narrative, okay? It doesn't go from beginning to end as a narrative. Right? It comes and it has all different things. It'll have some laws, it'll have some statements about Allah, it'll have some prayers that different people make, then we'll go back and give some narratives of this prophet or that prophet, then we'll go back and talk about an argument that Prophet Muhammad is having with the disbelievers that are around him, and then we'll go back and talk about some discussion that Prophet Muhammad had with the believers, and then we'll say about something that Allah is saying that the hypocrites are thinking in their heads. Okay, so we'll keep bringing all these different things. So, some people, you're right, some non-Muslims who look at it, they say, this book seems disorganized, it doesn't really make sense, I can't figure out what's going on. You know, and all the Muslims do is talk about how eloquent this is and how beautiful this is, and we don't really understand it. So, part of it, I would say, the Quran, of course, begins, the Quran is not a book, it's not a narrative book, it's not a book of history. And although the Quran contains some laws, it's not a legal book, it's not a book of laws. And even though the Quran refers to nature and refers to some of the patterns that God puts in nature, the Quran is not a science book either. Right? What is the book? What is the Quran's purpose?
Communicate the will of Allah.
Okay, yeah. So, And the way that we usually think of that is saying the Quran is like guidance, right? The Quran is huda. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins the Quran, He says, Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. This is a book in it without any doubt, or there is no doubt in it, guidance for the muttaqeen, the people with taqwa. Okay, so Allah is both saying, and what is taqwa? Taqwa is like an attitude that you have where you're conscious of God and trying to please God. Okay, where you live your life and the way you look at the world is you're trying to please God. So Allah is already saying that if you have taqwa, it will be guidance for you. But if you don't have taqwa, does that mean you won't get any guidance? I mean, it's possible to understand that from that. So it's possible that someone could read the Quran and not be guided by it, right? There are people that heard the Quran even in the original Arabic and they didn't accept Islam, right? Is that true? Okay, yeah. So the Quran doesn't necessarily guide you. You have to bring the right attitude to it, that you're looking for guidance, okay? So some non-Muslims might not be bringing the right attitude to it. Similarly, I know that sounds like a cop-out for Muslims to say, well, you're not bringing the right attitude to it if you don't know it. But it's true. Can Muslims ever bring the wrong attitude to the Quran?
Yeah.
Yes. What would be a wrong attitude a Muslim could bring?
I don't know.
You're very sure that there could be a Muslim could bring a bad attitude.
Like if they're not using it for guidance, if they're just using it to like revere, just for protection, like to just leave your car or something like that.
That's wrong.
In a way, if you're not using it.
So yeah, obviously if we say the Quran's main purpose is to bring guidance, it may have other purposes. Like all those things I mentioned, if you use the Quran to derive laws from it, is that wrong? No. If you use the Quran to find out things about science, it's not necessarily wrong. If you use the Quran to find out things about history, it's not wrong. But that's not the primary purpose that it has. And if you look at it only for that purpose or only through that lens, you're gonna miss the main message, and you may distort what you're looking at. So some people, I know people love finding science in the Quran, but sometimes people who their only purpose of looking at the Quran is to try to find some scientific fact, sometimes they could distort what they're reading to fit just some other scientific fact that they know, and say, wow, this is what the Quran said. You know, and then if 100 years from now science doesn't believe this anymore, then they're going to be like, oh man, what did that mean? I guess the Quran was wrong. No, you were just wrong. I mean, so we don't know for sure. We have to say Allah Alam, especially when people try to fit certain things in. So that's actually one of the biggest problems that Muslims can have, is either not using the Quran for the right primary purpose, or trying to look to the Quran to justify something that they want to do. Say like, okay, I was having this argument just with Nader about something, and I think you should do it this way, and now I'm just going to look in the Quran and try to find something to prove that I'm right. Right? Here, I'm showing him in the Quran that he's wrong. Okay? That's not right. You should be opening the Quran looking to find the right answer. Maybe you're wrong, right? Maybe you're wrong. Maybe, you should be looking for guidance from Allah. So the Quran, I think actually the Quran, one thing I will say first is that Quran, in my own experience with it, like right now, if I am even trying to read a translation, there's so many translations, and a lot of them are good, and I think most of them, to be honest, most of them do basically an okay job of communicating the message that's in the Quran. Okay, there's actually not that big of difference in terms of word choice and stuff like that. So anyone you pick up, you're going to get some benefit from. But I'm telling you, none of them will give you the miracle of the Quran, what the Quran actually is. So for someone like me, once you start to understand some Arabic, I cannot physically read like the translation by itself. Like I cannot go more than like one verse. I'll just be like, this is horrible. Like, let me read the Arabic. Okay, even if I don't understand every single word, or I might have to look up one of the words, still, it's not like the words in English, they don't sound anything good. It's like someone explaining to you something, right? Something that's beyond description. And they're trying to explain to you basically what it is, but you're not going to get the impact of it. So first, sometimes people, and those non-Muslims who say that about the Quran, some of them know Arabic and some of them don't. But for ones who know Arabic, they may be exposed to that, and we can talk about that in a second. But first of all, for people reading a translation, first of all, you will never understand the beauty of the Quran reading a translation in English. Because you're not reading the Quran, you're reading someone trying to explain to you what the Quran is like. So it's like, And I don't want to compare the Quran to anything because the Quran is the speech of Allah, and we don't compare Allah to anything. But it is like if you saw a magnificent work of art, or you saw something very beautiful and you tried to describe it to someone. Okay, it's not, you may be right in everything you're saying, but you'll never equal the experience of seeing it. Okay? You know, if you tried to describe for me the Mona Lisa, right? Would that have any impact on me? Okay, there's this woman and she's like smiling a little bit, but you can't really tell. It's really amazing. You're like, whoa, wow, that sounds amazing. Go ahead.
Does it ever say in the Quran why it was presented to people in Arabic and in that culture of that time? Does it say that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, if you read the Quran, you'll see that over and over it makes the point that it is in Arabic, right? And it makes a point that because it's in Arabic, it's clear, okay, to those people. And also, I think it has some of that idea of like what we're talking about, that the Arabic language has certain properties based on this trilateral root system and based on the people of the time. They were very like, language was extremely important to them, right? Okay, because they were a society where very few people knew how to read and write. But language in terms of like poetry and oral language was like one of their main art forms, okay? So language was something that was highly developed amongst them. And so that's one reason. I mean, I don't know if other people have thoughts. It doesn't really say like, this is why we chose Arabic instead of English or something like that. It does definitely make a point though that because it's in Arabic, it's clear and it's mubin and can be understood. So it's from my understanding, Allah is saying that these are characteristics of the Arabic language. Okay, and another amazing thing about the Quran is that the Quran actually has a kind of a limited vocabulary. Okay? It won't take you that long to learn like most of the words in the Quran. Like they can just, in terms of like the roots and knowing the vocabulary of the Quran. That's another thing that when you start putting a little time and effort into the Quran, you'll see the same word meanings repeating over and over again. So there's a vocabulary, it's not that huge, but at the same time, like there'll be certain words like fu'ad and qalb, like both words for heart, okay? But you'll see if you study it, that Allah is very careful about which word He chooses in which context. So it's very precise in using words that have similar meanings, but slightly different meanings in certain contexts. So even though the vocabulary is not that big, it's extremely precise. And this is what people who understand Arabic rhetoric and grammar and stuff love about the Quran, is that it's very precise in its word choice. It has these rhythms. It's very economical in terms of it says things in as few words as possible, but getting the full meaning. So it's really has this amazing thing. I still feel like I haven't answered your question. So I got to some of the reasons why the Quran is organized differently than a narrative, but it has an organization. And the more you study it, actually, people will show you that it's not at all arbitrary. And so people who read it and see it as being arbitrary, they're really not reading it deeply at all. You know, putting aside the whole thing about is your heart sincere and all that stuff, and that's kind of a spiritual, metaphysical question, but even just on a serious level. And there's this whole idea of iltifat. People are interested in this topic, I suggest you look at that. And there's articles on the internet about it. It's called iltifat in Arabic. One other thing about the Quran that you'll notice, like if I read this, even in this translation, it says, "It is Allah that conveys you by land and sea, and when you are in the ships, and the ships run with them, rejoicing in a favoring wind. A raging tempest overtakes them. Billows surge upon them from every side, and they fear they are encompassed by death. They pray to Allah with all fervor. Deliver us from this peril, and we will be truly thankful. Yet when He does deliver them, they rebel in the earth wrongfully. O men, your insolence is only against yourselves." And there's a lot of other examples, actually. So did anyone pick up what I was pointing out there? One of the things you'll notice about the Quran is that we said the Quran is the word of Allah, right? So Allah is speaking. The Quran is constantly changing the subject pronoun. Okay, it will start, which I know if you did that for one of your classes, the teacher would probably tell you that's incorrect, right? If you start out using second person and then all of a sudden you're using third person and then you're using first person. But Allah does that constantly in the Quran. Sometimes Allah will refer to speaking, He'll say we. Okay, this is the plural of majesty, that Allah is talking about something I'm doing, but He's using we to show like the majesty of it. Then He'll say, Allah. He'll refer to himself in the third person. Then he'll say huwa, he is the one. Huwa alladhi. Then he'll say you. Then he'll say they. So sometimes he'll say you, he's like he's talking to you who's reading. But then all of a sudden the same ayah later on he'll say they. Starting to put you in the third person instead of the second person. So it's really, at first you might think this doesn't make sense, it's all over the place. Like I said, this isn't following the rules of grammar. But if you see it and you break it down, you'll see there's a reason for each time Allah is doing that. And it's something that is the height of Arabic eloquence. That when he's saying we, like I said, it's because he's trying to show the majesty. And when he's saying you, it's because he wants you to think about it. But when he's saying he, it's trying to put some distance. Okay? And really, it's almost impossible to explain in English, really. Or not impossible, but you just need to spend some time with it. There's actually an article, if anyone's interested, by M.A.S. Halim, who did the Oxford translation of the Quran. The Quran, M.A.S. Abdul Halim, he did the new Oxford translation, which is, a lot of people like it a lot. But he has this whole article on iltifat, or grammatical shift for the rhetorical purpose in the Quran. And it's because this is a specific, and he talks about some of the early Orientalist writers, how they said, they brought up this specific issue that this doesn't make sense or this violates grammar. And he talks about how they're missing the point. Because it's not just that, oh, we can find a meaning in this. But it's that if you look throughout the Quran, it's always done the same way. Like this pattern is always used. Like whenever it's going to we, it's for this reason. Whenever it's going to you, to he, to they, it's for this reason. So mashallah, once you get into the Quran and you're reading it, it makes perfect sense. It seems like it moves your heart with it. But if you step back, you might go, hey, wow, that is weird. But if you look at it and analyze it, you'll see the purpose behind each one. Yes?
Can you tell us a little bit about how you think that this was seen in relation to the Quran and how those two work together?
Yeah, so even in the verse that we read, it started off saying, remember what is recited in your houses, the verses of Allah, ayat Allah, and hikmah, okay, and the wisdom, okay. And you see this in different places. You see kitab, book, and hikmah, wisdom. And other places you see ayat here and hikmah, wisdom. So, at least to some extent, some scholars have said that this is hikmah, wisdom is referring to the sunnah, or the way of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So the opinion, the Muslim scholarly consensus is that there's two kinds of revelation, the Quran, and then the sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him. That the way of the Prophet, which means things he did, things he said, things he saw and didn't say anything was wrong with him. All these type of things. So the sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and that is contained mainly in hadith for most Muslims, okay? Some Muslims have different ways of trying to get the sunnah, especially the Malikis. Like they'll look at what the people of Medina do, Medina where the Prophet lived, and they'll say, not now, but like say what they did for the first few generations after the Prophet Muhammad, and they'll say, look, we find all the people in Medina doing this, they must have learned it from the Prophet Muhammad. So this is the sunnah. Okay? But for most people nowadays, especially in our time, the only way we can get to the sunnah is to look at these hadith, which are the written reports of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and actions and stuff, that were communicated for the first couple hundred years orally, and then written down. So, and there were some hadith books before that, but the major books that we use were not written down until a couple hundred years after the Prophet. So, in some ways, the hadith are more like the Gospels. Okay, the hadith are things, incidents from the life of Prophet Muhammad that people remembered and told to each other, and then eventually wrote down into books. Okay? And the Muslims, the Orthodox Muslim view is that that's a form of revelation as well. That the hadith and the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad is a form of revelation as well. So you have the Quran and the sunnah. And in the main place, the sunnah works to explain the Quran. Like the Quran will say pray, but the Quran doesn't necessarily give, how do you know when it's Maghrib time? Okay? Or how do you know when it's Isha time? Okay, that's from a hadith. Okay, like how you should look at the shadows and all that kind of thing. So it will explain in more detail things, concepts, or that are mentioned in the Quran. And sometimes the Quran will go into some detail, and sometimes it will not go into hardly any detail, but the way you fill out those kind of meanings comes from the hadith. So they work together. Obviously, scholars spend a lot of time discussing, like, what do you do if they seem to contradict each other? To Muslims, they don't really contradict each other, okay? But that could be a different issue if someone thought that they did. So that's the general orthodox view. Now some Muslims in our times, especially Muslims who are more, they consider themselves progressive Muslims, and Muslims who are trying to change traditional understandings of Islam and be more flexible. A lot of times they'll start saying, like, we should focus more on what's in the Quran and not on what's in the Hadith, because that gives you a little more room to maneuver, right? Sometimes the Hadith, there might be a Hadith that's very clear about something, but if we take that away, maybe it becomes a little more vague if we just look at the Quran, and maybe we could try to understand the spirit of it. But that doesn't always, to me, and I'm not trying to be biased against it, but it doesn't really appeal to me, because you'll find that's not really true. I mean, the Quran is not always more, like, liberal than what the Hadith say. Sometimes the Hadith specifies something that you might find more harsh in the Quran. So a lot of times you find people say, we want to follow the Quran only. They don't really want to follow the Quran only. Like, because a lot of things that people have a problem with, like cutting the hand of the thief, or, these type of things, they're in the Quran, they're not in the Hadith. So it's not really the case that, the more liberal things is just if you just follow the Quran and if you follow things. Or the fact that a woman's testimony is worth, in some cases, half. You need 2 men to equal the testimony of 1 woman. That's in the Quran. It's not in the Hadith. So it's not like the Quran is always more liberal. Yes?
My question is controversial, but I think it's really important today,
Yes.
given everything that's going on. And as I said, I haven't read the Quran, so I want to take the opportunity to get clarification from a Muslim who has studied it. I think you would agree that what's focused on in the secular media today, in the representations of Islam, is the concept of jihad. I might not be saying it right.
Yeah.
And I know as a Catholic that when I read about Catholic doctrine in the secular media, it's like they almost never get it right. So I want to hear from a Muslim what that's about. The impression given, again from non-Muslims in the secular media, is that holy war against non-Muslims is approved of in the Quran. And I think it's important to know, given what's going on in the world, what's the accurate understanding of that? And I ask with respect.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. That's good.
I don't know myself. I'm not having started.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's complicated. Like, I wouldn't want to just say, there's no jihad in the Quran or something like that. That would be incorrect. There's no war in the Quran. That would be incorrect. So basically, the Quran is a scripture that does talk about war, does talk about battles. It does lay down sometimes when you should fight, sometimes when you shouldn't fight, some prescriptions for fighting. Not in enormous detail, there's much more in the Sunnah, but it does refer to those things. So, but the idea that, which seems to be what I get from the media, I don't know if you get, that there's somehow in the Quran it says that just fighting, whenever you fight non-Muslims or whenever you see non-Muslims, you should kill them or something like that. This is obviously not correct. Obviously, or why would all Muslims be sitting around here with non-Muslims and never doing that? No. It's ridiculous. It doesn't have anything, the Quran does not say that. Muslims never took that from the Quran. So there are, like I said, certain verses that refer to war situations. And they're meant to refer to, if you are in a situation where you are fighting a war, you should fight. You should fight hard. There are verses of the Quran where God is encouraging people, and mentioning, like, there's helpless people who are being oppressed, who are being murdered, who are being prevented from practicing their religion. Why don't you do something to help them? So it will say, like, you should do something to help them. So it would be hard in the context of reading those verses. It's not necessarily easy to argue that it would be hard to say that Islam is pacifist, that Islam never approves of violence, because these are times where it talks about times when violence is permitted. Okay, but it would also be hard to look at those verses and say that this violence is always encouraged, because those same verses, if you look at them, they'll always say, but Allah only do this if people are aggressing against you. Allah doesn't love aggressors. Or only do this against the people who threw you out of your home. Or only do this, and Allah does not have any problem, and Allah encourages you to be peaceful and have good relations with people who have good relations. So in the Quran, it's clear, and usually it's right after these verses. So people who cite these verses and ignore that part, they're really purposely misleading. Okay? And maybe they feel like they need to get that message out, but they're not trying to communicate what's really in it. So jihad, and actually in the Quran, the word jihad is, I'm sure people might have heard in the media, jihad means from jahad, that means struggle. Okay, so jihad is used different ways in the Quran, not only for fighting, for different kinds of struggle. Struggle to teach the Quran, struggle to establish justice, struggle against your own soul. So jihad is used different ways. In the Quran, actually, there's a different word called qital, which is more often used for fighting. Okay? But in Islamic law books, they started using jihad as a word for fighting when it was permissible at later times. So that's why sometimes people just focus on the word jihad. But the word jihad has a much broader meaning, so it's further misleading to talk about jihad. It's always been about war because it's not. But qital is fighting, and it has rules that are laid down in the Quran. Now, the rules of qital laid down in the Quran are, like many laws that are laid down in the Quran, can be seen as very progressive in that time period, and would be seen as very regressive in our time period. Okay, including like laws about women and stuff like that. They would be the inheritance laws in the Quran at that time were seen as very progressive. Like they gave a woman a lot more rights than she had in Arabian society or even Christian society at that time in Europe. I'm not attributing it to Christianity, I don't know, but in societies that were Christian, the women had less legal rights than what Islam and the Quran gave women. But it didn't give women those same rights that women have in our society today, legally. So that depends how you want to look at it. And obviously some of the interpretations of that and the way it was implemented are not necessarily correct. And this is very true in the area of jihad and politics in general, is that people looked at the Quran, looked at those verses, and they tried to understand it through the lens of their situation in the world at that time. Okay, in the world at that time, there was very little idea, and you know from Christian history, there was very little idea of two religions living side by side. You know, that wasn't the default. The default was one religion has to win out over the other. Okay? So the Quran entered a world like that, and people, so scholars, and I'm not even talking now about when the Quran was first revealed, I'm talking more like medieval period. Okay, so, you know, during the time of the Crusades even, or something like that, 1000 or 1100, 1200. This is a world where you don't have this idea of human rights, you don't have this idea of different states having, you know, international treaty frame. You may have treaties, but you didn't have an understanding that different societies and communities could live together peacefully, okay? There was always this kind of idea that the general default state is war between different communities, and that peace is kind of an exception, a temporary exception. So Muslim scholars living in that framework, they kind of looked at the Quranic text and they said, yeah, this is what the Quran says. This Quran says that you should fight against people who are, you know, oppressing you and who are not allowing Islam to be preached and who won't allow the religion to spread. And you can have treaties with them maybe for a short time period, but that's only temporary. Eventually you have to allow the religion to spread, you know what I'm saying? But for someone coming in our time, they might say, no, you know, now that's not the way we understand relations between communities. And we understand that, you know, someone can live in the United States and it doesn't mean that the U.S. is a Christian country and therefore the Muslims can't practice their religion. And so if the Muslims can practice their religion, then there's no one being oppressed and there's no reason that you should have to fight against them. So really people have to take the reality of our time and then get the guidance from the Quran and try to apply it. You know, and I think what a lot of difficulty comes is whether it's Muslims doing it and making mistakes or whether it's non-Muslims doing it and making mistakes, is that they look at how the scholars interpreted the tradition in a different time and place in a medieval period and applied it to their world reality, and they try to say, look, that has to be the exact same today, because we're talking about the Quran. The Quran is eternal, you know. But in reality, you're not talking about taking principles from the Quran and applying them. You're talking about taking interpretations from a certain time and place and applying them. And that's what we can't do, because that will just distort. So that's really the task for Muslims in our time period, is to really understand the society around us and understand how to apply the teachings of the Quran in our situation. And I don't think that's easy. You know, some Muslims would just like to say, oh, in our situation everything's great and we're all at peace with each other and therefore we should all be at peace. It's not necessarily that easy. There's still issues in our world. There's still oppression. We saw, mashallah, what happened in Egypt. I mean, there's still, most of the Muslim world still lives in complete oppression. Okay, where they can't, you know, they have no say over their leaders, where they, you know, they're being tortured on a regular basis. You know, security services who have no respect for anybody's rights. So what is the solution to that? Now, if we see that in our time, the most effective means to rise up against that is like we saw here, nonviolent, direct resistance to that. And is that something that we don't say the Quran calls? No, the Quran calls for that. The Quran's calling for standing against injustice. This may be the most effective means in our time. So we should be able to understand that and apply it. And if trying to fight against, even if we thought there was a country, say Russia, who was oppressing Muslims in Chechnya, if they had tanks and planes and nuclear weapons, maybe, you know, taking out your sword and going against them is not going to work now. Okay? Maybe we have to find a different way to resist against them. But we still have the principles of the Quran to teach us that, yes, these are the situations in which it's right to resist, and these are the situations where it's not. So, I hope that helps a little bit. I know it doesn't exactly answer the question, but we can talk more. What time is it?
Yeah, it's almost 5:30.
Okay. Yeah, so anybody else have anything they really wanted to hear about? Yes.
I know there's a few divisions within Islam, Sunni, Shiite, Sufis, would they all take the same stance that you're taking with these things that you've addressed?
You're talking about specifically the last question?
Well, would they,
Putting the last question aside for 1 second,
well, I know
yeah.
Shiites wouldn't, but
in terms of which?
in terms of a lot of times Shiites take the stance of fighting back.
They may, that's actually, I mean, I know why you would say that, but there's actually, amongst all those labels that you meant, there would be all these different divisions. There would be some people who are more peace-loving and some people who are more aggressive. Even subdivisions among all groups. So those would be different. So those are, because those, like I said, those are based a lot about your political understanding of the world today, as much as it is the scriptures. So people differ about their political understanding of the world today. They'll apply the scriptures to. But the rest of the talk, like the Quran in general, would be the one thing that totally unites all those different sects. We all believe in the same Quran. We all believe in all the things that is the word, speech of Allah. For Shia, they would have difference. Actually, not so much in what I said. They believe in following the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, but how they derive the Sunnah is different from how Sunnis do it. But we didn't really go that detailed into how each of us derive the Sunnah. There would be different Muslims, like especially Sufis you mentioned. Again, there's a wide variety of people that fall under the label Sufis, but some Sufis have used kind of esoteric interpretations of the Quran. So they'll look at the Quran and find kind of mystical, hidden meanings that wouldn't be obvious to anyone who's not kind of part of that spiritual, they believe it's from spiritual insight. So that would be a different that some Muslims wouldn't go along with, but that some Sufi Muslims would follow mystical interpretations of the Quran and stuff. Other than that, you know, pretty much what I said, that really is one thing that unites the Muslims is the Quran and the text of the Quran and following. So yeah, sister?
Is the Quran viewed as like a reflection of God's revelation?
The Quran viewed as the
As a perfection? Because like as opposed to like all the other religions and other prophets that can come, is it like the final edition essentially? Or for now, is it the final edition?
well, Muslims believe that, like I said, and you know, you'll see, we touched upon it, but I wish we could have talked about more, that the Quran really is, it refers to all these biblical prophets, and it really sees itself very consciously, if you read the Quran, engaging in the tradition, what we would call the Judeo-Christian tradition, but which we consider Judeo-Christian Muslim tradition, you know, that really sees itself coming out of the Abrahamic religions, and those set of books, and you actually, a lot of Western academic scholars of the Quran spend a lot of time talking about, you know, what particular religious rivalry, either in Judaism or Christianity, is the Quran commenting in this or that. That the Quran is commenting on a lot of theological debates among different Christians or among different Jews in the way that it chooses to present certain biblical stories. So that would be their fear. For Muslims, we don't, when people, a lot of Western academics spend their time thinking like, if the Quran talks about Abraham, the Quran talks about Noah, and the Quran talks about Jesus, it's obviously doing it, it's getting some stories from Christians and doing kind of it for Jews and getting kind of an imitation of it. And if it has some things that are not the same as the Bible, well, they kind of made a mistake. They thought they were taking that story, but they made a mistake in the way that they told it and something like that. From a Muslim perspective, first of all, we believe the Quran was revealed from God, so we don't believe that Prophet Muhammad collected stories from their communities. But we don't have a problem if there's similarities. In fact, we love that there are similarities because to us they're all revealed from God, right? So to us, the fact that there are similarities shows that God revealed the Torah, the Old Testament, God revealed the New Testament, and God revealed the Quran. So that the fact that there'll be similar messages or similar figures mentioned makes sense, only makes sense to us. So we don't take it as an offense that they're the same thing, but some Muslims might take it as offense if you say that Muhammad got it from some other people because we believe Muhammad got it from God, from Allah. So, but at the same time, there will be some differences and there will be some things that Muslims could either say in certain cases that we believe that the actual teachings have been distorted from what Jews or Christians have today and what they believe. We believe in certain cases maybe there's been some distortion of those texts. Another thing, and Muslim scholars have differed over that, how much distortion is there? Like if you look at the Torah or you look at the Gospels of today, Muslim scholars over time have actually differed a lot over how accurate are they as to what actually was revealed by God. Some scholars have said it's all the same that was revealed, but then the way that some of the meanings are understood has been corrupted over time. And some Muslim scholars will say it's all been corrupted, there's nothing left of the original book. That's the way Ibn Hazm talks. But most scholars will say that a lot of it is preserved, but maybe some of the meanings are misunderstood, or we would understand them differently. But some part of it maybe was put in later by different scribes or changed for different reasons. But to be honest, most of the difference is because the Quran, when it tells the story, and this is true to some extent, obviously, of the Bible as well. But the Quran definitely is not trying to tell, here's everything about Moses, here's everything about Jesus. The Quran is trying to draw, it briefly alludes to something about Jesus or something about Noah or something about Moses to teach you a lesson. Okay, so it may only be getting a certain thing that you may not focus on or that you may not think that's important, but it's just drawing your attention to that to teach you a lesson because it's a book of guidance, like I mentioned. So, but like the sister mentioned, so we believe, so really if you're interested or if you know the other scriptures and you read the Quran, you'll really see what's going on. And to some extent, what you'll find, it depends. It depends, I guess, on your theological perspective in your own tradition. To a certain extent, you'll find so many similarities, but at the same time, you'll find very profound differences. Obviously, especially with Christians around the issue of Jesus, you'll find so many similarities, but at the same time, you'll find a deep underlying, profound difference in the way that we see a certain figure. So it's really interesting to read and correspond, but it's definitely coming out of that tradition. But at the same time, we believe that the Prophet Muhammad was the seal of the prophets, and that the Quran is the last revelation. And we believe the Quran, like this unique thing, that the Quran has been preserved and protected, and that it's in its same form, and anyone has access to it. We believe that was intentional because there's not going to be any more scriptures or any more revelations, so the Quran has to continue to be preserved and protected, so that anyone around today could still say, like, if I want to get guidance from God, I can go directly to the Quran. Whereas we say for some other scriptures, you may not be able to go directly to the source. Okay, and we also believe that other scriptures, the Muslim belief is that other scriptures, in their main message, we believe all the prophets taught the same thing. Monotheism, and basically monotheism and the golden rule. Right? That these are the main messages of every single scripture. That you only believe in one God, you worship God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and that you love your neighbor as yourself, or you do unto others what you have been doing. All these types of things. This is the essential message we believe every single prophet taught, but specific details like the Jewish dietary laws or this or that might be different for different communities. But we believe that all the other books came for specific people for a specific period of time, and that those times are actually up, and that the Quran supersedes those other texts in the sense of legal difference.
So is it kind of like an act of mercy that you feel the final edition, essentially, the holistic view of what God wants his followers to use it kind of like an act of mercy?
Definitely, from a Muslim perspective, is, and this is why one of the descriptions of the Quran is that it is a rahmah, it is a mercy, and the Quran is something that, yeah, as you said, it's a mercy and a final revelation that kind of sums up all the previous. That's another belief that Muslims have, is that kind of sums up all that's important in all the previous revelations and it's available, like you said, to anyone. So that's a difference between, we believe that prophets brought like miracles to prove that they're prophets. Like Jesus healing the sick or raising the dead, or Prophet Moses with the serpent and the stick. So we believe that the miracle the Quran brought, the miracle that Prophet Muhammad had, the Quran, one of the miracles that he had, the Quran, that's a miracle that's still around for anybody to see. Right? So anyone who can study and be exposed to it, that's one of the mercies that's still there for us. And again, you can only be exposed to that really if you learn the Arabic language. You can be exposed to the message of the Quran through a translation, but that's like someone telling you about it. But if you want to actually experience the miracle, you have to, learn the Arabic language enough to understand. So I just want to end by pointing out some of the names of the Quran, just to get a sense of what the Quran is to Muslims. So Quran is Al-Kitab, the book. Quran is Kitab al-Maknoon, the preserved or protected book. The Bashir, the Quran is giver of glad tidings, a promiser of good things to come, Bashir. The Quran is Huda, guidance, like we mentioned. The Quran is Mubin, it's clear. The Quran is Shifa, it's a healing, it's a mercy, as the sister mentioned, it's a mercy. The Quran is Al-Haq, it's the truth. The Quran is a tadhkira, a dhikr, a reminder. The Quran is Mukarrama, Marfu'a, Mutahhara. The Quran is purified and honored and dignified. The Quran is a Furqan, it's a criterion between right and wrong. The Quran is a bayna. The Quran is an ayah. It has ayah. The Quran is a sign. The Quran is a nur, it's a light. The Quran is a maw'idah. It's like an admonition, it's like a sermon, it's like a warning. So all these things are words the Quran uses to refer to itself. And that's another thing that you'll get if you read the Quran. The Quran is a very self-referential text. Like, I don't know, does the Bible ever talk about like the Bible?
It refers frequently, one book will refer frequently
To another book. Okay. So you can do that. But the Quran talks about itself. It will say the Quran is this or that. The Quran is the truth. This is the revelation that came down to you and guided you. So the Quran is a very self-referential text that talks about and argues for itself. Okay, so it's very, you engage directly with it, and we believe, like I said, that's the speech of Allah. So when you engage with the Quran, you're engaging with Allah, but it has all these different functions. It gives the Muslims, the Muslims are engaged with the Quran. The Muslims read the Quran in every salah. The Muslims, especially during Ramadan, try to read the whole Quran during the month of Ramadan to remind themselves and get close to it. But that's why I would encourage all the Muslims to try to develop closer relationship with the Quran, to try to make sure not just in the month of Ramadan or not just in the Arabic, but both the Arabic and the meanings, try to get close to it, know what's in it, try to use it as a source of guidance, not just as a source of blessing. It is a source of blessing. It is something that should be honored. That's something that made a big impression on me early on, that Muslims, even non-practicing Muslims that I would come across, non-practicing meaning Muslims who might not pray, might drink alcohol or whatever, I knew they were Muslim, but they would, if they saw like I had my Quran in my bag and I put my bag on the floor, all of a sudden they started running after and like, I'd be like, what's going on? This guy doesn't even pray or anything, And it was even like a translation of the Quran, to be honest. It wasn't even, he didn't have to do that. But and we saw some of this with the whole burning the Quran fiasco, is that sometimes Muslims are symbolically attached, or it's part of their identity that they stick up for the Quran or something like that. But if you ask those same people, like, okay, what is the first commandment in the Quran? Or what if I go through Surah Al-Baqarah, what's the first thing it asks me to do? Or what do you think the Quran says about nature? Or what's the Quran's view about the rain? They wouldn't be able to tell me, really. So that's a sad thing. It's more important that we get the guidance from the Quran. it is important that we respect the Quran, like we should respect all scripture, but it's more important that we take the guidance from the Quran. So I think we went over the time already. Jazakallah.